Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Anne Tolley.
Mr Speaker, as Minister of Social Development, I welcome the release of this report, and I thank the Children's Commissioner and the office that I know have put a great deal of work into it. I've said publicly it makes pretty grim reading, and I stand by that. But it's not news to me, and in fact over the last almost 12 months as I've been the Minister, I've had reports from the Children's Commissioner as he has been out and about doing the job that we task him to do, inspecting residences and family homes, and I've met with him and we have talked about a number of the issues that he has raised in his report that we're debating today. And one of the reasons that I welcome his report is, of course, his report itself highlights the concerns that led to my decision earlier this year to appoint an expert panel to lead a complete revamp of the Child, Youth and Family Service. And I said it earlier in the House, we've had 14 reviews of CYF over the years. Some changes have been made, a large amount of money has been put in, extra social workers have been added, but at the core of it, the experience of young people in care hasn't changed significantly. And I say that because although we don't have the data to show that, and that in itself is a concern, I've had 3 years as Minister of Police and Minister of Corrections, and almost 70% of the people in our prisons have had contact through Child, Youth and Family. And I think that that is a terrible indictment on a system that takes the most vulnerable children in our communities. Those children, takes them out of their families to keep them safe, and then doesn't give them better lives. And I give I think that the most important work that I will do as a minister is change that system so that we can all be proud of a child protection system that indeed protects our most vulnerable children and gives them better lives when the state steps in and takes them from their family. So let me go to, before I go to the recommendations from the Children's Commissioner, can I just say to the House, there are no quick fixes here. And that's why I say chucking a bit more money in, throwing a few more staff in, is not going to make the systemic changes that we need to make. So it's not going to happen overnight, but by the end of this year, the expert panel that I have appointed, working with a team of up to 50 people drawn from across the government agencies, will have designed a new system to put in place for this Child, Youth and Family. There may well be legislative changes that will come to this House next year, but we are determined to make sure that we redesign the system, we resource it properly, we focus it properly on what is most important in the system, and that is the children. So if we come to the recommendations from the Children's Commissioner, first of all, his first recommendation is that we set clear expectations. And I have to say, when I first became Minister and the agency was working already on a modernisation program, one of the very first queries that I had of them was, did they really understand their core business? And if you look at the terms of reference that I've given to the expert panel, that is front and centre. What is the core purpose of Child, Youth and Family? And I was delighted to see that the Children's Commissioner had set that as his number one recommendation: set clear expectations, child-centred and a direction for CYF. And then he outlines some particular parts of that. Recommendation 2, be fully child-centred. I have set up, as part of this process, an advisory group of young people, 8 young people aged between 15 and 23 who have experienced state care. And they are amazing young people. They are incredibly heart-rending stories that they tell of their experience. Some good, a lot not so good. And yet they have come through that process and are prepared to get involved with redesigning a system that's about them. That's about them, their siblings, their families, and the children that come after them. And that's what I saw in Europe when I went earlier this year to have a look at what other jurisdictions were doing. That was one of the key things that I noticed that we weren't doing here. We talked a lot about having a child-centred system, but the way it was operating was all about processes. And the Chief Social Workers review showed that our frontline social workers were spending less than 15% of their time face-to-face with children and more than 50% of their time with paperwork. And that told me that our system was not child-centred. We talk about it, but it wasn't in practice. And so I was determined that we were going to have that in our system. So two things I did. One, I brought a man from Scotland out to be part of that expert panel. Duncan Dunlop is the chief executive for an organisation in Scotland called Who Cares Scotland, which is an agency independent of government that works on behalf of with children who have been in state care. They lobby government. They lobbied the Scottish Parliament to lift the age to 21, and they're going for 25 maximum, that children need to be supported while they're in state care. They provide activities and they provide identity for children who have been in state care. So in order to ensure that we had those children at the heart of whatever system we redesigned, I asked Duncan Dunlop to be part of that expert panel. And when I talked to his fellow panel members, that is what he is driving. He's been up and down, we've made good use of him, he's been up and down New Zealand, meeting and talking with young people, with caregivers, with organisations that are working with these children and talking about that. So I'm confident that we will end up with a system that will be child-centred. Recommendation 3, invest in children and care placements. Again, this was something I saw in other jurisdictions. We have increasingly children with high and complex needs that may not be able to be, that are not being currently well supported in foster care places, simply because those foster care parents, even though they are well-intentioned, don't have the support, but certainly don't have in many cases the skills. We need to think carefully about those placements, and the children themselves tell us that. Had a young girl tell me that she and her sister were taken into care. Her sister was very disabled both intellectually and physically, and whilst they were put into care together, it became very obvious very quickly that the foster parents could not cope, particularly with this really disabled sister. There is part of a good news story with those two, because even they were separated and the young disabled sister is getting very good care. The sad part of the story is that they haven't talked to one another or seen one another or be in contact with one another for something like 7 or 8 years. So we do need to be very careful about the in-care placements, and we need to invest in those properly. One of the concerns that I have is whether we're putting children back into some very financially stressed families and who are unable to cope, and so another placement happens, and that churn that the children talk to us about, where they're being pushed from pillar to post, and all they really want, what they tell me they want, is that first placement is the best placement, it's the right fit for them, and they can settle down and get on with the rest of their lives. So welcome that recommendation from the Children's Commissioner. Recommendation 4, addressing capacity and capability issues, and we talked about that earlier in the House. The Chief Social Worker is leading an internal process around the practice and the ongoing development of good practice and the sharing of good practice around the country. In addition to that, we do need to look at the support that we give to our social workers. And as I've been around the country and talked to SIF staff, they desperately need the support of some of those specialist services, the child psychologists, the therapists, the cognitive development help, all those specialist services that they need to deal with the trauma and the complex needs of these children. Recommendation 5, I think, Mr. Speaker, I've talked in question time about the considerable work that's happening because 57% of the children that SIF works with are Māori, and when you talk to the children there, cultural identity is important. They want a connection with their hapu and their whānau. They want to know that they have a place that they can identify with that tells them who they are, and there's a lot of work happening in there. Recommendation 6 is the classic. If we don't have good data about what happens to these children, how can we learn from their experiences? There is not good data. I've been amazed as a minister at the paucity of data as to what happens to children whilst they're in state care, and that will be changed. And I welcome the really good emphasis that the Children's Commissioner has put on that. We need to monitor the health and the education progress of these children. We need to know if they're doing well at school so that we can put in the extra resources. Mr. Speaker, I've stood in this House and talked about national standards and for all kids in education. Well, it's even more important that at an early stage we follow what is happening for these children and what extra help they're going to need. And then finally, recommendation 7, set clear expectations for other state agencies. Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to tell this House that I have already begun talking with my colleagues in the social sector, in education and in health and in justice, and we are all determined that we're going to work together to make sure that the most vulnerable children in our community get top priority, that they get the resources that they need and they get the opportunity that they need and that they deserve to live full and successful lives. Mr. Speaker, this is a good report from the Children's Commissioner. I welcome it as part of the major piece of work that this government is doing to ensure that every child that comes into state care we treat as if they were our own.